Satchmo Festival. Give yourself a hand for being here, please. I appreciate you. A few announcements to make. First of all, get your noise-making devices, cell phones, and I don't even know if we have beepers anymore, but please silence them or turn them off altogether. And we also have some wonderful notepads outside in the hallways of the two different floors with some ink pens there. Grab one if you need to, because these great scholars that we have here, you may only hear them once in a lifetime, and they have some great information for you. Particularly our next gentleman coming up. We are honored to have him. Well, I'm Don Lewis. Welcome to the 19th Annual Satchmo SummerFest, presented by Chevron and the Hilton Satchmo Legacy Stage. Woo! Yeah, you can applaud that, please. And this event is produced for some of my dear friends. They call themselves the French Quarter Festivals. Give them a hand, please, as we wouldn't be here without them. It's a nonprofit organization showcasing New Orleans culture and heritage since 1984. This event is made possible through sponsorship of community-minded organizations and the sale of a beat of beer, Jack Daniels, Sonoma Cutrer, Corbel, Tequila Herradura, Finlandia, Pepsi, Aquafina, Bubbly, Bayou Rum, French Market Cold Brew, Louisiana Iced Tea, and festival merchandise, which helps pay for great entertainment, security, sanitation, recycling, EMS, and production costs. Please support your festival by purchasing from our beverage and merchandise booths. And by the way, there's some festival merchandise that you can get only when you come to the festival out there now, just saying. And do your part to keep the festival clean by using recycling and trash containers on site. And support our recycling effort by purchasing a reusable souvenir cup at our beer and cocktail booths. And please, enjoy responsibly. Special thanks to the Satchmo Legacy Stage contributors like Hilton, Harrah's New Orleans, Joseph K. and Inez Eichenbaum Foundation, Ella Fitzgerald Charitable Foundation, Barbershop Harmony Society, the Fertel Foundation, Ricky and Vicky Newigan, and Andrea Duplessis. And thank you to all our sponsors, including Chevron, Brown Furman, Abita Brewing Company, GE, Fidelity Bank, WWL-TV, Offbeat Magazine, and so many, many more. Please pick up a schedule for your viewing pleasure with a full listing of all performances, events, and the culinary lineup. Go grab a bite before the next act begins and stop by the merchandise tent to purchase the official Satchmo SummerFest poster, shirts, and souvenirs. And please enjoy the 19th Annual Satchmo SummerFest, presented by Chevron, and happy birthday, Louis Armstrong. Without any further ado, make some noise for our next speaker, please. We're honored to have this gentleman because he's a former scholar. He's still a scholar, but he's a former archivist for the Hogan Jazz Archive. So we're honored to have him. Thank you, sir.
Thanks so much, everyone. It's great to be here. I want to begin by thanking David Cunian and the entire team at French Quarter Festivals Incorporated. This is a long-term love affair, Satchmo SummerFest. Recent scholarship by Matthias Hyman of the University of Antwerp, who presented here about 3 years ago, highlights the importance of visual representation in shaping perceptions of the jazz tradition. Hyman declares that photographs, quote, can be effective tools in understanding and contextualizing the lives and music of jazz performers, especially when detached from, quoting Hyman again, use as a visual rhetoric to the construction of jazz icons. In retrospect, some depictions stray so far from heroic narratives that it's hard to see them as anything but demeaning and shameful. Included in the 1920 photograph of the New Orleans Police Department minstrels, which you see here, are two jazz musicians, Sicilian-American banjoist Dominic Barocco on the right, and behind him the clarinetist Alcide Yellow Nunez and Isleño, Canary Islander, thus the nickname because canaries are yellow, but he doesn't look very yellow here because he's in blackface. In his book, Blackface, White Noise, Michael Paul Rogan uses the term racial cross-dressing to describe a process by which Jewish immigrants like Al Jolson were Americanized through an initiation into whiteness by donning blackface. And one is tempted to interpret the intent of the Sicilian and the Isleño pictured here, both of whom could be considered non-white at the time, according to that theory. But this is New Orleans. Yet there may be more, in other words, to the story in this case, given the arcane proclivities that are often associated with New Orleans masquerade culture. The convergence of carnival masking and obsessive racial fetish in New Orleans offers a lens for exploring and decoding jazz musician behaviors through photographic representations. How race and class were performed by jazz musicians depended to a large extent on the functional imperatives that governed the marketing of their services, in conjunction with the opportunities that racial ambiguity deriving from Creolization in New Orleans provided under apartheid. Relevant New Orleans eccentricities would include carnival and its concomitant masquerade culture, such as Black Indians masking on St. Joseph's Day. It's a Sicilian holiday. Interracial sex, institutionalized in both the 19th century practice of plaçage and then, of course, notoriously in the brothels of Storyville, and the ratty underclass music that came to be known as jazz. Accordingly, this presentation follows the localizing whiteness path established in such works as Displacing Whiteness, Essays in Social and Cultural Criticism, edited by Ruth Frankenberg, but factoring in the special features attributable to Creolization in New Orleans. In other words, the intent of this presentation is to view the first wave of seminal jazz musicians who traveled beyond the region, not as icons, but as musical entrepreneurs, seeking advantage in markets that were often unreceptive and alien to them, and to use photographs to understand those experiences. How did they use cosplay, today's social media buzzword for masquerade, to achieve their objectives, and what did it mean to them? In a city that's grown ever more dependent on tourism, marketing has become increasingly critical for survival. Within the jazz community that emerged there in the early 20th century, the correlation of masquerade, marketing, and créolité invited manipulation of racial categorizations, in many cases substituting blackness for whiteness as the dominant paradigm. Indeed, this became synonymous with selling authenticity, as with Leo Dejan's Black Diamond jazz band in the 1920s. This imperative generated a trick bag of tropes for a much broader range of spiritual miscegenation, which is Rogan's term, than he covers in his study. So a few cases in point before we get to Louis Armstrong. First, the African-American cornetist King Oliver, Joe Oliver, consistently used the term Creole to describe his bands. Under what mandate? How was passé blanc, passing for white, under segregation, used by New Orleans jazz musicians, both intentionally, as with the Afro-French clarinetist Achille Baquet in various bands, and tacitly, as with Jelly Roll Morton's 1923 recordings with the New Orleans Rhythm Kings? And why was Louis Prima, a Sicilian-American, fired at Leon and Eddie's on 52nd Street in New York in 1934 under the suspicion that he was not white, he was passé blanc? Jazz emerged at a time of racial reconfiguration, driven largely by black agency and imagination. Taking their cue from black vaudeville, a black marching club called the Tramps insinuated King Zulu's blacks in blackface into the city's carnival establishment in the years 1910 through 1923. Zulu masking could be read as subservience by whites or as heritage by blacks, and that ambiguity enabled the penetration of what had been whites-only public space related to carnival. The years of Zulu's rise also witnessed the waning of Creole culture and identity. In Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, a suit brought by a New Orleans Creole, Homer Plessy, who initially expected to win on the grounds that he was not black, the Supreme Court sanctioned the implementation of segregation, thus finalizing an American assault on Creole privilege dating from 1803, when the Americans took over, and exacerbated during Reconstruction following the Civil War. From the American perspective, Creoles had hitherto occupied the penumbra between white and black from the racial perspective, part African, part European, but they were culturally French and free. Segregation eradicated Creole privilege, and Creole exoticism was transmuted into a marketing trope. The term became an ethnically detached signifier used to sell hair products, food, and musical entertainment to consumers with refined tastes. King Oliver's Creole band was photographed in black underclass vaudeville drag outside of the Pergola Dance Pavilion in San Francisco, probably in mid-June 1921. The costumes that they're wearing in this image represent railroad workers, domestics in the case of Lil Hardin, and field workers, occupations that were considered by whites to be suitable for blacks at the time. Honoré Doutre and James Palau were in the band. They were the only Creoles. The rest of the band was African American, but they went under the title, the Creole Band. The title of this presentation derives from a confrontation that occurred at the California Theater in San Francisco in September 1921, by which time Warren Baby Dodds had replaced Minor Ram Hall, pictured here on the far left, on drums. In Larry Guerra's The Baby Dodds Story, Warren Baby Dodds tells what happened, quoting Dodds. In Frisco, we had some trouble, and the local union hated to take us in. We were booked at the California Theater as King Oliver's Creole Band. When the band went on for a matinee, some little smart guy in the audience said, "I thought you said those guys were Creoles. Those guys are no Creoles, those are niggers." Of the whole band, only Joe Oliver and Doutre could talk Creole fluently, so they began to speak it very fast. The people just stared, and that ended the episode, but afterwards, the theater was no good. Meanwhile, the Pergola dance date, which was supposed to be a long booking, had also fallen through, end quote. That incident effectively scuttled Oliver's chances for success on the West Coast. And by April 1922, he was stranded in Los Angeles, sitting in with Jelly Roll Morton's band at Wayside Park and the Grand Hotel, bereft of a band of his own. Returning to Chicago, Oliver enticed Louis Armstrong to join him in August of 1922, and then a reunited Creole jazz band with the Dodds brothers, Doutre and Hardin, back in the fold, and Bill Johnson on bass and banjo, embarked on a series of recordings in 1923 that led to success for Oliver and everyone associated with him. It became the launching pad for Louis Armstrong. Yet the California Theater incident is worth pondering because of the questions that it raises. Why did Oliver insist on representing his bands as Creole, given the fact that he was the son of a Baptist preacher from rural Louisiana with no discernible Afro-French heritage? And how did a white heckler in the Bay Area know enough about what the term meant to challenge Oliver's authority to use it? Clearly, the antagonist's perception of the term was racial. In his mind, Oliver was too dark-skinned to be a Creole. In fact, reports of brown paper bag tests notwithstanding, Creole identity was much too diverse ethnically and culturally, and to be predicated on race alone. The Creole preference was to see the term not as racial, but as cultural, as a linguistic signifier. Yet even before Plessy, control of that image was slipping away. In Out of Sight, The Rise of African American Popular Music, 1889 to 1895, Lynn Abbott and Doug Seroff track Sam T. Jack's Creole Burlesque Company of African American performers beginning in 1891, whose success led to competition and an oversaturation of the market by 1895. Jack was a white theatrical entrepreneur from Pennsylvania. He conceived of the name after a trip to South Louisiana and provided a show that combined burlesque with what the authors describe as, quote, a blurry amalgam of farce comedy and the theatrical display of shapely women in elaborate, revealing costumes, end quote. Not surprisingly, the implicit suggestion of sex in Jack's promotional strategy was rendered explicit in New Orleans with the Storyville experiment, but with a twist. Alicia Long's investigation of prostitution in Storyville has shown that white women represented themselves as Creole octoroons and Latinas in order to charge more money for their services. Despite its definition as black after 1896, because of the Plessy decision, Creole remained a racially ambiguous hinge mask that could swing in both ways because that's what the white patrons who went to the district desired: forbidden sex with women who were legally black but looked white. They wanted a racial masquerade, but as Long points out, it was not always the one they expected. Like Zulu's blackface, Creole became a mask that could simultaneously reinforce or subvert racial imaginaries, and jazz musicians were quick to pick up on these implications. But Oliver's Creole posture was about cultural immersion, not race, and understanding it requires familiarity with his experience as a musician in New Orleans. Before coming to the city in 1900, he was raised in the rural hinterland outside of Donaldson, Louisiana, called A Bend, Louisiana, because there was a bend in the Mississippi River where he was born. French speaking was common there, thus his fluency in Creole dialect, which came in handily in California. More importantly, the band leaders who hired and trained Oliver in New Orleans were all Creoles. The cornetist Manuel Perez was a French-speaking Creole of Mexican heritage. You see him here on the far left. He was a Latino who, along with the Tio family, was among the most revered music educators in the downtown 7th Ward. From 1904, he was the leader of the Onward Brass Band, which was an amalgam of Creoles, Latinos, and African Americans. Perez was a legitimate reading musician. He was well trained. But Paul Barbrand, whose father Isidore played in the Onward, credits him for moving the band in a ratty direction when he took over. Perez understood the need to adapt to a changing market being driven by intuitive players like Buddy Bolden, and what Peter Bocage called improvisation. Oliver, who was still pretty ratty when he joined the Onward, despite some rudimentary reading skills, probably joined them in 1913. And here's what Albert Nicholas had to say about it, the appreciation of a get-off man in Perez's Onward band. Brass bands, quoting Nicholas, were mixed bands, Creole and uptown, meaning black, in a brass band. They were solid. They were one. Joe Oliver and Manuel Perez. See? End quote. Indeed, Oliver's widow, Stella, described the relationship across the Creole black color line as quite chummy. In 1914, Oliver replaced Freddie Keppard in Armand Piron's Olympia Band. Piron's the violinist, shown here. And in 1917, he affiliated with Edward Kid Ory in what was probably the most popular jazz band in New Orleans at the time. And when Oliver left, Louis Armstrong was his replacement. Observers describe Oliver as peaking with Ory, using mutes to achieve hot freak effects on cornet, as with I'm Not Rough, a blues showcase for talking horn, or wah wah, or baby crying. But apartheid soon intervened. On June 19, 1918, the fun came to an abrupt halt. A police raid on the Winter Garden on Gravier Street put Ory and Oliver in jail for disturbing the peace. And as his wife, Stella, recalled, Joe thought it was awful that a man who was making an honest living could be taken to jail like that, so he went to Chicago. He was driven out of town. In fact, this was Oliver's second incarceration for disturbing the peace. On June 1st, 1917, he had been arrested with Armand Piron, Billy Mack, and some unspecified women from Storyville at a private residence on Palmyra Street. Oliver left New Orleans in August 1918 as a result of the arrests and at the invitation of two groups of transplanted New Orleans musicians in Chicago. Bill Johnson, the erstwhile bassist and leader of the original Creole Orchestra, he was not actually a Creole, even though he employed some, and Lawrence Dewey, a country Creole from Lafayette, Louisiana, took turns hiring him. By October 1919, Oliver had supplanted Dewey as the leader of the band we see here at the 1919 World Series and at the Dreamland Cafe, and he began the arduous process of upgrading personnel, trying to get the best players in the band that he possibly could. Although one can argue that the Creole trademark applied to his California band could have come from his residual association with Bill Johnson, it's clear that his interest, Oliver's interest in Creolite, was in place before he moved to Chicago. Oliver had shared a lot with the Creoles, including police harassment, but it was especially evident in a standard of excellence that became intrinsic to his self-image, which included performing in tuxedos, as we see here, another form of masquerade designed to meet the expectations of upscale white patrons seeking illicit thrills during Prohibition. As a brand, Creole conveyed not only an explicit connection to New Orleans, but deriving from that, it was a marker of jazz authenticity at a time when ersatz versions were proliferating. Oliver's intent was much the same as that of Nick LaRocca in his naming of the original Dixieland Jazz Band, only Oliver's claim was more viable. Indeed, this is essentially the argument that Ernest Bornemann made for jazz as a product of Creolite in his Creole Echoes articles for the Jazz Review in 1959. Yet, one must inquire into the racial implications of Oliver's actions. Following the mass desertion of the members of the Creole Jazz Band by early 1924, Oliver recruited Albert Nicholas, Paul Barbaran, Barney Bigard, and Louis Russell, three New Orleans Creoles and a Latino from Panama, for his new band, the Dixie Syncopators, which name denotes a somewhat mysterious departure from Creole representation. Indeed, one might consider the reference to Dixie as problematical given its Old South associations. Perhaps one should also mention that the band had a steady booking at a club called The Plantation in this period. Did Oliver recruit these Creoles primarily for their musical skills, or was he also attempting to implement an ethnic upgrade or lightening of the band's image? In other words, reverting to racial thinking, leveraging Creole and Old South nostalgia in order to appeal more effectively to a white audience. It's hard to imagine, but we have to consider the possibility. Nicholas remembered how self-conscious Oliver was about his dark skin shade and how the Creoles would tease him about it. Quoting Albert Nicholas, Joe Oliver was sensitive about his flat feet and his black color. During one of Oliver's solos at the Plantation, Jelly Roll Morton passed and said, "Hey, Blondie." Once Barney Bigard drew a foot and put it on Joe Oliver's music rack. Oliver was so mad and said if he found out who had drawn that foot, he would fire that person, but he never found out. Morton liked the kid and would always have the last word. Oliver and Morton were close friends, end quote. Some scholars have used Morton's teasing of Oliver as proof that Jelly Roll Morton was a racist, but as Nicholas affirms, such remarks were typical of the kind of playfulness that passes between good friends, apropos of what's called the dozens, a form of African-American verbal sparring. The duets on King Border Stomp and Tomcat Blues, recorded by Oliver and Morton in December 1924, and their frequent covering of each other's compositions on recordings, provide a very different perspective, revealing an intimacy based on sincere appreciation and mutual respect. Yet given Oliver's purported sensitivity about race and the concomitant suggestion that his adaptation of Creole branding could have been a product of shame, was the psychic impact of apartheid a factor in such representations? In fact, it seems unlikely, based on the expressive power that's evident in the early Creole jazz band recordings, before failing health took its toll on Oliver in the 1920s. Oliver's cultivation of a marketable image with terms King, New Orleans, Creole, jazz, or even Dixie was essentially pragmatic, based on direct references to his past experiences and associations. It was designed to yield a competitive advantage in the market by emphasizing authenticity. His use of Creole representation should therefore not be interpreted as an attempt to circumvent his racial heritage. When the white heckler made his remarks in San Francisco in 1921, the last thing he expected was for Oliver to answer in French. In defending himself, Oliver fought race with culture, just as Creoles had been doing for years, until their ethnic identity was obliterated by apartheid in 1896, thanks to the Plessy decision. Accordingly, some Creoles did engage in racial cross-dressing to adapt to segregation by passing for white, a form of cosplay that became difficult to shed once adopted. Was this behavior a product of racial shame? Since most Creoles differentiated themselves from all Americans, including blacks, it can't be characterized so simply without embracing the standard bichromatic racial paradigm. One scholar has described clarinist Achille Baquet as fooling the white band leader Jack Lane in the Reliance bands with whom he worked, but the reality was undoubtedly more complicated. Achille's father, Dejan, was not only the leader of the Excelsior Brass Band, a prominent Creole marching band, but also the president of Local 242, the first Black American Federation of Musicians union in New Orleans, established in 1902. So it seems unlikely that Lane would not have known about the family, particularly since they lived in the same neighborhood, in the 7th Ward. What mattered to Lane were the skills as a performer and educator that Achille Baquet had to offer his band. Again, pragmatism. Whatever works, whatever's best for the band, try to navigate the racial issues that were obstructions. Baquet later worked for the white trombonist Happy Schilling and then went to New York City, where you see him here with Frank Christian as part of Jimmy Durante's band. Meanwhile, his brother George, another clarinetist, toured with Bill Johnson's Creole band and eventually settled in Philadelphia, living as a black man. Two brothers, one passing for white, one living as a black man. Given simplistic racial categories based on bichromatic strictures of whiteness, some Creoles simply thought of white as the more appropriate category, Plessy versus Ferguson notwithstanding, and yet others clearly did not. So households divided on the issue, brother against brother. The tragedy is that Creoles were forced to choose, since an identity based on Creolite was no longer an option after Plessy. Perhaps this is why identity as a jazz musician, a creative professional judged by merit, mattered so much on both sides of the color line. Ferdinand Joseph Lamotte was another Creole who used Masquerade to advance his musical career. The name change from Mouton, his stepfather's surname, to Morton was a capitulation to Anglophilia, masking his Francophone heritage. The nickname Jelly Roll, which is sexual slang for genitalia, drew upon his experiences in Storyville and Black Vaudeville and took him about as far away from Creole propriety as he could go. But it was an effective marketing tool. Here's a photograph of Morton in blackface with Rosa Brown taken in Texas in 1914 during his time in vaudeville. But I don't think we should interpret it as proof of George C. Wolfe's characterization of him as a self-loathing black man denying his heritage, as suggested in Wolfe's Broadway musical Jelly's Last Jam, an indictment that's also found its way into the scholarly literature. Another image of Morton, this time in tuxedo, conducting a tutorial with members of his Red Hot Peppers in 1926, is closer to the Creole mark in terms of conventional expectations, but the contrast reminds us of how New Orleans jazz musicians used various forms of cosplay and masquerade according to the needs of the moment. In fact, tuxedos were yet another form of masquerade for New Orleans jazz musicians, often deployed to cater to the pretensions of affluent white audiences that equated jazz with the allure of forbidden thrills in speakeasies. But that's a process that unfolded gradually. Photographs of New Orleans jazz bands at home before 1917 rarely depict them in formal attire. More often than not, they're in pseudo-military uniforms, street clothes, or costumes. Portraits of Oliver's Creole Jazz Band and the New Orleans Rhythm Kings from 1923 thus illustrate a pronounced shift in the marketing strategy, reflecting the enhanced market value that derived from representations in formal wear, especially when these bands were seeking to engage out-of-town audiences. The trombonist William Baby Ridgely of the original Tuxedo Jazz Orchestra recounted his change in fortunes after the band, which was named after the Tuxedo Dance Hall in Storyville, began wearing tuxedos for performances at the suggestions of an uptown swell, a white man, Sims Black. The pay went from $1.50 a night per member in 1915 to $15 a night for sidemen and $25 for the leaders by 1925. That's a huge financial boost for that band. Of course, with or without tuxedos, the color line did not evaporate when these musicians traveled to northern cities, as seen in Jelly Roll Morton's July 1923 collaboration with the New Orleans Rhythm Kings, pictured here, a white band, for Jeanette Records in Richmond, Indiana. In the wake of D.W. Griffith's 1915 film Birth of a Nation, the Ku Klux Klan became politically ascendant and controlled the legislature in the state of Indiana in the 1920s, and Jeanette, in Richmond, Indiana, made promotional records for the Ku Klux Klan. So a racially mixed recording session was potentially risky business in 1923. The trombonist George Brunies recalled how the New Orleans musicians closed ranks on the issue, utilizing racial ambiguity to defend Morton. Quoting Brunies, "Husk O'Hare arranged to have us make the Jeanette records. Paul Merez had run into Jelly Roll Morton, and we worked on his Mr. Jelly Lord and Millenburg Joys, which we recorded with him. We thought it best to say he was a Cuban, so that's what we did." When questioned about it, the band members pointed out a diamond inlay in Morton's front tooth, which was accepted as positive proof, in other words, a vindication by ethnic stereotype. This vicarious passe blanc demonstrated how a shared musical language rooted in a somewhat attenuated communal reality in New Orleans, because segregation existed here, could still foster spontaneous connection among strangers despite segregation. Under the auspices of whiteness, a white man could hardly imagine a worse fate than being perceived as black in the United States. But in the jazz community, it was considered to be a badge of honor by the late 1930s, as when Marshall Stearns portrayed New Orleans Rhythm Kings as an authentic derivative of black precursors in a series for Downbeat in 1936. Decades later, Gilbert Erskine's highest praise for New Orleans Rhythm Kings in his article on George Brunis in the May 10, 1962 Downbeat was they could swing like a black band. Under segregation, Sicilians, Jews, and Latinos could be perceived as marginally non-white in the early 20th century. And growing up in New Orleans, crazy quilt neighborhoods like Treme or the 7th Ward further exacerbated this process by coupling perceptions of parochial cultural eccentricity with racial ambiguity. As we've seen, New Orleans jazz musicians used racial, ethnic, and class stereotypes to dramatize or enhance a musical performance. They used cosplay, but in some cases, the stereotypes were imposed on them. The career of Sicilian-American trumpeter Louis Prima, whose interaction with Creole and black musicians began when he was a child in Treme, they were his neighbors, illustrates the point. According to conventional accounts, Prima's playing style was influenced by tuition from his older brother Leon, but in fact, he also took lessons from the trumpeters Henry Kid Rena, who was a Creole, and from Lee Collins, who was an African-American, seen here with Arthur Durbany and Danny Barker. In other words, the training that led to Louis Prima's skill level came from all backgrounds available in New Orleans. The concentration of so many Sicilians in the downtown areas of Treme and the lower French Quarter, areas governed by ethnic admixture, racial admixture, what demographers call crazy quilt demographics, meant that their exposure to black music was intensive and perpetual, especially given the amount of music that was performed on the streets. In 1934, Guy Lombardo got Prima his first job in New York City at Leon and Eddie's on 52nd Street. But he was fired before he could take the stage because the proprietor refused to believe that he was a white man. As Lombardo described it, quoting Lombardo, Eddie Davis, on first seeing olive-skinned and swarthy Louis Prima and knowing that he came from New Orleans, had simply assumed he was a black man. Prima went next door to the famous store and actually put Leon and Eddie's out of business. That's a different story. Prima had absorbed the Afrocentric culture of his native habitat, Treme, completely, and it showed. No wonder he was one of the most popular white band leaders to perform at the Apollo Theater in Harlem 5 times in the 1940s, and he became notorious for the extent of his interaction with black musicians in New York and Hollywood. From the 1940s on, he used his New Orleans-ness and his Sicilianità as trademarks, expanding his repertoire beyond jazz by purveying Italianesque tunes such as Angelina, O Marie, and Zuma Zuma, a supercharged remake of the highly suggestive C'è la luna mezzo mare, delivered with a blistering New Orleans shuffle beat. Prima's Masquerade may have been in the eye of the beholder, but New Orleans musicians had routinely used stereotypes in the early dissemination phase as part of a broader marketing strategy to engage Northern audiences, pandering to their prejudices in amusing and sometimes controversial ways. In addition to business cards that read, "Music for all occasions," or "What you want, I got it," they cross-dressed as hillbillies, as in this image of Tom Brown's band from Dixieland in Chicago in 1915, or the same band at New York Century Theater, acting out a topical tableau vivant of urban chaos on stage as policemen, rubes, and street urchins tussled in the streets. Or we could look at Williams and Piron's vaudeville troupe in 1915, dressed as roustabouts with their lunch pails. Or we could look at Mabel Elaine, a white woman in blackface with a black New Orleans band led by Lawrence Dewey at the Grand Theater in Chicago in 1917. They're dressed in prison garb. These musicians crossed class, ethnic, and racial borders with impunity at times for the sake of performance. Throughout his long career, Louis Armstrong actively exploited the contradictions inherent in bichromatic visions of race, donning whiteface, or something like it, flower, for black vaudeville audiences at the Iroquois Theater when he was a teenager, or satisfying white expectations of blackface characterizations in films and stage productions during his rise to stardom in the 1930s, or blacking up to be honored for getting beyond blackface when he was masking as King Zulu on Mardi Gras Day 1949, even if it meant there would be hell to pay for it once he got back to Harlem. The backlash directed against Armstrong as a result of the King Zulu blackface has been covered in various presentations at Satchmo SummerFest, and I'm sure I don't need to recount it for you, especially in light of the recent developments involving the current governor of Virginia and the Attorney General there. Blackface is taboo. But as Lynn Abbott and Doug Seroff have shown in numerous publications, such as Ragged But Right, blacks performing blackface minstrelsy were operating under a much different set of cultural and racial parameters than their white counterparts were. That doesn't necessarily make the masquerade less controversial, as ongoing debates locally about the use of blackface by Zulu will attest, but it does make it different. The early 20th century black vaudeville, from which the Tramps and thus the Zulu Social Aid and Pleasure Club originally derived, was an exercise in reappropriating power, taking back control of the blackface mask and repurposing it to celebrate black cultural creativity and to appeal to black audiences. The same impulse today animates the work of the Lafayette-born graphic artist Michael Ray Charles, who teaches at the University of Texas, Austin. His renditions of vintage blackface marketing are ferocious and undermine the conventional power relationships that have sustained apartheid in the United States. There can be no doubt that as far as Louis Armstrong was concerned, being chosen as King Zulu was one of the greatest honors ever bestowed upon him. The criterion for selection of King Zulu has always been achievement and community service, and Armstrong was highly qualified on both counts. To be sure, he enjoyed his reign immensely, and one doubts that shame entered into his experience at all. He was too busy having fun to worry about it. But were there residual psychic effects? The criticisms directed against him in the black press must have stung at least a little. Yet, as Bjorn Barnheim showed here 2 years ago, the Zulu experience was followed by an intensification of Armstrong's commitment to civil rights issues. He did think about it. He did get something out of it. He acted as a result of that contemplation. And this is also why it's useful to place Armstrong's Zulu episode within the broader context of New Orleans jazz musician behaviors dating back to their earliest touring experiences. For black musicians, engaging in masquerade of all kinds was required to compete effectively in a market catering substantially to white audiences and usually dominated by white control. Combining an original and appealing form of music with masquerade to penetrate white resistance by strategically manipulating racist stereotypes allowed black performers to subvert American apartheid, even if that wasn't their intention. The power of the music did it for them. But in the process, they may have learned something important about themselves. In Playing Indian, a book about indigenous people in the American imagination, Philip J. Deloria comments on the feeling of liberation that can accompany masquerade. Quoting Deloria, "Almost everyone has experienced the sense of personal liberation that attends the wearing of a disguise," preaching to the choir in New Orleans. Be it Halloween masks, cross-gender clothing, or garments signifying a racial, ethnic, or class category different from one's own. At the same time, however, wearing a mask also makes one self-conscious of a real me underneath. This simultaneous experience is both precarious and creative, and it can play a critical role in the way people construct new identities. Precarious and creative. Sounds like New Orleans to me. Seen through the lens of classist or racist assumptions, the cosplay stereotypes employed by New Orleans jazz musicians can seem demeaning and about as far from heroic iconography as one can imagine. But from the perspective of early 20th century New Orleans jazz musicians, they could also be viewed simply as fun, just like masking for carnival, except you got paid for it. For these musicians, pretty much everything outside of New Orleans was terra incognita anyway. So risks were inevitable, and a disguise of some sort was mandatory. That's how you protect your soul. Their hometown cultural comfort zone was a matrix of masking, racial ambiguity, and self-promotion, and they drew upon it to bring their music to the world stage, by which time they were performing as artists in tuxedos. While the potential subversion of racial boundaries implicit in such behavior may have briefly disrupted American apartheid on occasion, the motives of New Orleans jazz musicians were usually less politically ambitious or tendentious. More often than not, they simply desired the freedom to play what they wanted with whomever they pleased as frequently as possible and to pass a good time and get paid while doing it, a utopian dream to which New Orleans jazz musicians still aspire, with or without costumes. Thanks for your attention.
Great work. Make some noise for him, y'all. And we have 3 or 4 minutes for questions if you want. All right. Any questions? I can come around you guys because some people are just talk softer. Question? Oh, right there. All right. Coming back to you. Wait for the mic. I feel like Donahue. Anybody remember Donahue?
Yep. Thanks for the wonderful presentation here. Just a question. Is it reasonable to walk away with the conclusion that the Creoles, in a way, played a role in making the jazz music more popular and more accepted to a population that would be more sensitive if jazz was straight black?
Well, the question that sort of lurks beneath all of this is when they put on the costumes, who made them do it? It's probably true that most of these guys are not self-elect. If you look at Larry Gauchy's book on the Creole band, they were forced to do a plantation skit. And so, again, they're being forced into a mold, just like Burt Williams was forced into a mold with blackface. And, of course, Armstrong does the Elter Eatmore sermon as an homage to Burt Williams. So that's a heroic act that Louis Armstrong celebrates in 1938 with those Decca recordings. Even though it's a comedy record, there's something important in terms of the motivation for why he chose that material and did it the way he did it. So, this is the problem we have. If there was such a thing as a racially neutral United States, what would jazz be like? That conflict motivated a lot of musicians. And Louis Armstrong, there's a whole point of view that Armstrong activates in 1957 when he comes out publicly and challenges Ike over, what's happening in Little Rock. And then my colleague Bjorn Barnheim was here and said, well, by 1949, and particularly with some of the post-Brown decision local legislation preventing blacks and whites from interacting in New Orleans, which affected Louis Armstrong's performances, he gets very active. But there's also a subtlety that's required. I think David Oswald told the story of what happened in Memphis when the band was arrested, and then they let him out if they come do a show, and then he dedicates a song on the radio, which is going out. It's like a national broadband, so audiences in Harlem are listening to it. He dedicates "I'll Be Glad When You're Dead, You Rascal You" to the Memphis chief of police, who happens to be a grand wizard in the Ku Klux Klan, and Armstrong didn't know that. So, he came, but white pride, white hubris, there was no way in the world a black man would insult the white sheriff on a national radio broadcast, so it must have been, a sincere compliment. So these are the kind of weird concatenations you have to deal with when you're talking about race in jazz music. But what I've always striven for is to try to talk about race, but also include everybody in the conversation who contributed. So, we can even talk about Nick LaRocca. I mean, we can't exclude him, even though he was into white superiority and he was an arch racist and he wasn't really much of a cornet player anyway, but he's part of the story. So we have to go all over the place and we have to shield ourselves because we're going to experience some really negative stuff when we start digging into jazz history, because that's the history of our country. We're not beyond race. So that's an excellent question, and I mean, you're going right to the heart of the matter is, how do those limits affect these guys? And that's why I tried to do a kind of reverse heroic iconography thing in this paper, because it's like jazz studies people are looking at heroic narratives in a kind of negative way, and it's like, well, that's mythology. But the fact that even when people are dressing up in ways that can be read as demeaning, they might still be doing something heroic. And the fact of the matter is that these jazz musicians put that music across, and this is one of the strategies they use to achieve it. So in retrospect, we have to say this: jazz made it. Louis Armstrong, was like the ballistic missile of jazz, but there were a lot of other guys involved as well. And jazz made it. Jazz is a world music now. There are people all over the world that embrace this music thanks to these guys. So it's always problematical when you look into American history like that, but that's who we are. We have to face it.
We got time for one more quick question? Right there in the front. Okay.
Again, Bruce, thanks for a great presentation. I was struck by the fact that you used the term apartheid. You didn't say Jim Crow or segregation, but you used what was an Afrikaner term in a different place, different context. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about why you use the term apartheid.
Because I think that's what it was. You know, it's a stronger term to me. And if we look at what's happening globally, that's another reason to use it. Because, you know, we like, oh, well, at least we're not South Africa. Well, maybe we shouldn't be saying that. So it's simply a stronger term. That's why, I mean, I use segregation too, because that's what they call the legal rulings. But when you look at the entire system, which is about a lot more than segregation, it's a system of apartheid and control, erasure of black presence, sanitizing genealogies. You know, all these things that tried to remove that population, which is the essential defining unit of New Orleans culture, as far as I'm concerned. How can you erase that from our history? You can't. Might as well just celebrate it.
Eloquent presentation. Mr. Bruce Raeburn, everybody. We miss him dearly. He's in Seattle, is it? Where are you?
Spokane, Washington.
Spokane, Washington. All right. Mr. Bruce Raeburn, thank you so much. And in a few minutes, we'll have right here a very exciting presentation on female jazz trumpeters right here on the Legacy stage. Thank you for coming.
Hello, this is Robin Barnes, the Songbird of New Orleans. Welcome to the 19th annual Satchmo SummerFest presented by Chevron and the Hilton Satchmo Legacy Stage. This event is produced by French Quarter Festivals Incorporated, a nonprofit organization showcasing New Orleans culture and heritage since 1984. This event is made possible through the sponsorship of community-minded organizations and the sale of Avita, Jack Daniels, Sonoma-Cutrer, Corbel, Tequila Herradura, Finlandia, Pepsi, Aquafina, Bubbly, Bayou Rum, French Market Cold Brew, Louisiana Iced Tea, and festival merchandise, which helps pay for great entertainment, security, sanitation, recycling, EMS, and production costs. Please support your festival by purchasing from our beverage and merchandise booths. Do your part to keep the festival clean by using recycling and trash containers on site. And support our recycling effort by purchasing a reusable souvenir cup at our beer and cocktail booths. And please, enjoy responsibly.